Hey everyone, welcome to the program WRSA Radio. I am your host, Grenadier One. Hope you guys are having a good week. I've had kind of a rough one actually. I was sick all last weekend and the beginning of this week with what I was concerned at first was one of the rare symptoms from the coof, and I started feeling better though, and that kind of got me through it. So that's not what it was, but I boy, I was down. I would not wish that on anyone. So it was the stomach condition, man. I thought I had gotten, or I think I got some kind of stomach bug that was just really, really, really bad. So I was a little under the weather to say the least, and kind of pressed a bit to get caught back up with work this week, and so it's been a little bit taxing on me, and I didn't have much time to put into this show this week. So I hope it turns out pretty good, but we'll see how it goes. So this week's topic, and probably it's going to be next week's topic as well, as I think it's worth more attention than I'm giving it today, and I'm trying to work up an interview that expands on the subject for next week's show. This week I'm going to focus a little bit more on what I would call the external, and next week we'll kind of look more internal. But it's we'll see how that one pans out. I know I've said before, and I've not been able to really deliver, so I'm not going to go into it on who it is, but I'm trying to get an interview worked up. Just understand, for whatever reason, I've had problems getting people available to record something, at a time that I'm also available, and so I've had people think that, people that I think that you guys would be very interested in hearing from, that I can get interviews because I know them, or I've got contact with them, maybe even some roundtables and things like that. But making the time and the space, or getting the technology to work out, is just something that I've not been able to really get to yet, and really put the time into it. So I'm going to do that, and hopefully this one works out. So we'll see. I don't want to overpromise here, because I haven't been able to deliver yet. But anyway, so that's where we are. So this week's there were some comments on Gab in conjunction with an article from Carl Dahl that was posted over on the mothership, and it got me thinking about this week's topic. And I had some posts, and Carl had some posts, and over on Gab, and we kind of got into a little conversation. But anyway, so the topic is this formation of covert resistance groups. And it happens to tie together well with a book that I'm currently reading. And I want to give you guys a quick rundown of this book, and recommend it to you, as well as another book from the same writer that's also very good. I think you should read the first book, obviously, that he did, which is on his time in the Spanish Civil War, before you read the one that I'm reading, as it's the second one in the series, and you'll get a better insight into who the guy is, and where he was before World War II. Really, you could read them out of order, between the first two, because the second book is just really his time in World War II, and he references the first book a few times, but it's really more of just kind of understanding the character and kind of the guy's background for the second book, that you would want to, kind of read the other one first. But anyway, they're both very good, excellent books. And I'm talking about the writer's name is Peter Kemp, and his book, the second one, is called No Crest or Colors, which is about his time in Europe during World War II. And his first book is called Mine Were of Troubles, which deals with his time in Spain, and his fight for the nationalist cause, which is really excellent. It's a rare look at the conflict from the nationalist side, as most of the English sources that we have access to are done more from the communist side of that conflict, or what they called Republican. It wasn't Republican necessarily it was communist. Let's not hide that fact. No Crest or Colors deals with his time during World War II. Kemp was is British, and shortly after the war breaks out, he works his way into the service, British Special Operations, and he's in the commandos at the beginning, and really from their inception, he's part of the early cadre of training these commando forces that are gonna conduct raids, and they go through all this training, and he participates in some of the raids that are carried out on the French coast after the Germans occupy France, and that's just the very beginning of the book, and you really kind of get through that part very quickly, and then the bulk of the book deals with his shift from being more of that active sort of commando type to what the British called SOE. And basically, this is a force that goes behind enemy lines secretly and works with subversive groups, covert groups, and organizes to affect enemy activity. And it's essentially really what the U.S. Army, like the Green Berets, do, what they do today. So the move has Kemp. He transfers from raiding the coast of France all the way to Cairo, Egypt, which is where this command is for SOE. And eventually he's deployed into the Balkan country of Albania. And Albania at this time is under occupation of the Italians, who, as you should all know, are allied with the Germans for the war. So he's parachuted into the hills of Albania, where he links up with resistance fighters they're already operating against the Italians and the small German presence that's there. And the bulk, like I said, this is the bulk of the book. It does eventually move to him getting into Poland, but the bulk of it is his time in Albania and Yugoslavia. Now, the savvy reader will note that what is described in this part of the book is really the underlying currents of the conflict that broke out when Yugoslavia later broke up in the early 90s. It's those same kind of groups and forces that are really working and fighting one another there. So it's a very, very interesting read. It's something sometimes a little hard to keep track of the names of all the Albanian players, as some of them have very similar names. They're Muslim, so they have these sort of trending in their names that they use, and that can be a little bit cumbersome. But his writing style is very good, very flowing. And it's really easy to follow, outside of the naming thing. But he gives us a glimpse into a resistance movement that really is made up of multiple different factions and not really interested in working together. Basically, what we have are a resistance group that is pro-communist, which is the larger and better supported force, and a secondary force that is what you would call really like an Albanian nationalist force, or an independent Albanian force. And these two forces are constantly positioning themselves and working against one another. It's really kind of, I won't say it's comical, because it never really breaks out into these really, really terrible sort of, funny, tragically funny type things. But if they had gotten out of their own way and had actually worked together, they might have achieved something more, something different, something sooner, But they're constantly positioning themselves and working against one another. And Kemp and the other British teams that are in place are basically there to provide assistance to these groups in the form of gold or arms and tactical advice. And what is happening from the very early stages is that the two groups are already seeing the long game. They're looking to a time after the Italians and later the Germans themselves are gone. They're plotting to position themselves to be in charge of Albania after the war, which I found very, very fascinating. It's very interesting. And they try to work the British into supplying them with arms and money and never really committing to any kind of large military action, because they want to preserve their own forces. They don't want to go up against the Germans or the Italians and get massacred and then not, be too weak to be a player after it's all said and done. The only time they really undertake any kind of serious combat is when they are defending themselves from counterinsurgency operations, or when they've got just a overwhelming, force that they can ambush and get rid of a convoy or something like that. They're only operating when it's absolutely safe for them to do so, which is very crafty, on their part all around. It's smart from a guerrilla tactical standpoint to operate that way, but then the fact that they're able to look that long game is something that I found very, very interesting. Now, we know how the story ends on this one. As the war drags on and the Russians push westward, they eventually drive out the Germans, and all of Eastern Europe falls under the communist sway. So eventually, of course, the communists in Albania are the ones that come out on top, and they take predictable measures against the former nationalist or independence leaders and their supporters. And many of the men that Kemp meets in his travels and he works with, he points out that they're later killed by the communists, and some of those even before the war ends. And there is this undercurrent that goes all the way back to his time in Spain, where he is devoutly anti-communist. So he does not really dodge any opportunity to point out where the communists did things that were unsavory. At points during the course of his travel through the country and work with these various leaders, Kemp paints a picture that makes you kind of ask, why did the nationalists continue to work against the Germans? Why did they not use the Germans to get rid of the communists? Well, they tried that on several occasions. There were even some of the nationalist groups who did actually go to work for the Germans, after the Italians surrender and withdraw their forces when the Allies take Rome. The Germans come in and they take over the primary occupation of that area. And some of the forces at that time really changed their focus. Either from the nationalist side, they really stop actively working and stop actively doing a lot of things. They don't want to provoke the Germans, because the Germans kind of go into this harsh reprisal role that the Italians really had not taken. But they don't want to necessarily fight the communists either, because they're in that same situation. They don't want to get themselves wiped out and not be able to do anything after the war. So they simply kind of shut down. Some of those groups that did work with the Germans were working against the communists, but they just never were really able to make a big impact. The communists were too well dug in and a part of the population, and they just simply would retreat and regroup. So there was never any real decisive blow delivered that rooted out any of the groups completely. For the Germans, this area was mostly a sideshow, and they didn't want it to become a complete drain on resources. So they never really went in there with full, occupation, heavy, overwhelming force. But it would be interesting to see, had the nationalists taken more of an active effort, would they have been able to achieve some level of independence after the war? If they had managed to wipe the communists out and be the de facto power in that area, like Tito in Yugoslavia was able to kind of work his own deal with the Russians, even though he was a communist. He was really independent of the Soviet, hegemony, I guess you would call it. But anyway, this kind of brings us around to the gist of things in regard to how this relates to us. I don't think anyone is thinking much beyond the current short horizon timeline for our situation. No one seems to be thinking about, what is it going to look like after all of this is over? And that's understandable, because we're not prophets and we can't predict what's going to turn in the next few weeks, much less after some long civil struggle that involves kinetic activity. So I get that most people would be thinking simply in terms of how do I make it through the next 3 months, okay, now the next 6 months, okay, now 12 months, and so forth. I understand that, but that kind of assumes that they're thinking about this at all. As we know, most people are still in this kind of somnambulous state between sleeping and awake. So, how do we look long term and think about that? Because clearly there are considerations for that which will drive current behavior from a planning and an action perspective. Have a look over at the mothership today at the piece that's posted detailing a secret speech given by a Chinese general. This is on the J.R. Nyquist blog and Pete's link to that. And we must take this with a grain of salt because, we know that secret speeches carry a lot of baggage with them when they're leaked. Okay, was the leak intentional, for example? Well, however, if we take this at face value, this general says that China's ultimate goal is to attack the U.S. to remove it as an obstacle to China becoming the, quote, Lord of the Earth. Now, it's unclear if he means a physical invasion of the U.S., and I do not read that into his statement. I think what he means is full spectrum conflict, and this attack will be from all fronts, including internal and using third-party actors and things like that. That's probably not a revelation in any way. It's really just confirming things we already have a lot of evidence to support. So when you put those things together and considering that this speech was delivered, decades ago, you kind of start to see that, well, okay, this is kind of laying the groundwork for a lot of these things that have come after. It really paints the picture of what they're doing. But one of the things he does mention, however, that piques your ears a little bit is using biological weapons on the U.S. and basically coming in to clean up afterwards, setting up what amounts to a colony under control of the CCP in the United States. Now, that's pretty dark, I think. When you kind of step back considering everything that's happened. Now, I disagree with the assertion in the article that the U.S. is the prize for China and that Taiwan is just a diversion. I believe that Taiwan is a critical aspect to China's future plans and that the U.S. is simply in the way of those plans. So, of course, we would be the bigger military threat and the focus of Chinese military operations, but Taiwan is the phase one objective. From there, they can move on to their goal of spreading out further physically, but and I've talked about this before, I've mentioned it on Gab, the capacity that they gain by taking Taiwan from a technological standpoint is so much more than what they would get from just physically occupying that space as a diversion. That's not what it is. From there, like I said, they can move out and spread out further. They are looking, according to this general, for living space, which they say they don't want to use those terms and make that kind of statement because of the historical links to the Germans, but they do mention Australia, which I find interesting, and they mention that as a place that has the land and natural resources they are looking to control. And they do mention the U.S. in that same context, but I think the U.S. physical landmass is a long-term play. It'd be like a stretch goal on Kickstarter. If you were doing, authoritarian tyrants Kickstarter, the U.S. is like the ultimate stretch goal. Taiwan is the first phase, that you get the Taiwan and the little plastic unicorn keychain with for your first Kickstarter goal. But I think that kind of brings things a little more into focus for you. So put yourself in the place of those communists in Albania And they were not thinking about the immediate situation dealing with the Italians and the Germans as much as they were thinking about what comes afterwards. They were already understanding that the Russians, i.e., the communists, are coming. They're going to roll back the Germans and they're going to be in complete control of that whole region. And they were planning on being a part of that and facilitating their position in that hierarchy. And their actions were working towards that goal, not just that short term conflict with the Axis. Look at what the so called government in Australia is doing to its people. They're setting up a mini version of Chinese style state control of their country. Are they also thinking in that long term? Are they demonstrating to the Chinese that they're willing to cede dominance to China, but you know, they still want to be an active part of that, an active role in running their country? But oh yeah, you'll be in charge, so to speak, China, but we'll play by your game. We'll follow your rules in your direction. It's not an if China goes on the march, it's when China goes on the march. Is that how they're thinking? I think clearly they're giving that indication. They're thinking in this same long cycle that those Albanians were thinking in. And now move back to the US government. Our government is demonstrating some of the most baffling behavior that only makes sense when you look at it as it being deliberate. They're working with purpose to destabilize everything in our country in order to pave the way for what they're calling, the Great Reset. And I think it's clear that this Great Reset sees China as the superpower, and everything is being shifted to make that transition as easy as possible for them. Now, I want to use a metaphor, an analogy here a little bit, and that is that, a nation is like a human body. It has its internal processes and functions, its internal thoughts and ideas, and it also has its external processes and functions and its external thoughts and ideas. Just like a human body, also it faces threats that come from both internal and external sources. And there's a great deal of activity that goes on inside of our bodies that we do not pay attention to because we're so externally focused. And everything about us is focused outward. Think about that infection from a virus, for example. It's an external threat that enters our bodies and becomes an internal one. And we don't see this internal struggle, we just feel the effects of it because our vision and our scale of comprehension is not down to that level, but we all know that it's going on inside of us. We feel those symptoms. We pay attention to it because we know that if we don't do that, it can kill us, and we have to address it either through medications or whatever, rest or whatever means that chicken soup, whatever means that you do to address that. And too often, I think, because on a national level, the situation is reversed, that being we focus far too much on the internal than the external, that we often miss the threats that are facing us from the outside. We ignore those conflicts and developments that are not happening close to us because we don't see the signs and symptoms of those things. We don't medicate it. We don't think about it, and we don't pay attention to it. We don't take the steps necessary to address it before it grows out of control. Again, it's our scope and our focus. It's just not facing the right direction. Now, I say all these things to stress to you the need to be thinking both locally at a tactical and operational level, but to also keep an eye on and consider the larger strategic aspects of what is going on. What is taking place externally to the U.S. and how those things can and do influence the decisions that you need to be making in your own backyard. When you're building your resistance group, be thinking about this. What are you going to focus on? How are you going to plan and think and direct your actions if you're not taking into consideration these larger pictures, these larger things that are going on? Anyway, go out and get all of Peter Kemp's books. He has 3 of them. The third one deals with his time in the Far East at the end of the war. And I've yet to read that one, but it's on my list. And also go get Carl Dahl's book and give it a read as well. It's called Faction. So I wanted to throw out a poke for that. Follow the conversation over on Gab and come see us on the mothership, because that's all the time I got for today. So I will see you on the next episode.